Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation, Assessing Culpability, Context Before Conviction. Today's webinar is hosted by AEquitas. My name is Holly Furman. I'm a Senior Associate Attorney Advisor at AEquitas, and I will be introducing today's webinar. If you have a question during the presentation, please enter it in the chat box. We will answer questions at the end of the webinar with time permitting. You are also welcome to contact us directly at any time following today's presentation, and we will send you contact information during our follow-up. AEquitas's mission is to improve the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices that increase victim safety and offender accountability. As a national training and technical assistance provider, AEquitas develops resources, conducts trainings, and offers 24/7 consultations for prosecutors and allied professionals. For more information on AEquitas, please visit our website at equitasresource.org. You can also follow AEquitas on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and the link to each is available on our website. Today's presentation is our second webinar for the Just Exits Initiative, supported by the Novo Foundation. The Just Exits Initiative is transforming justice by closing on-ramps to and building off-ramps from exploitation, by educating prosecutors and law enforcement about the reality of sexual exploitation and trafficking, supporting efforts to improve our response to exploited women and girls, including making sure that they are not unjustly criminalized, collaborating to improve survivors' access to appropriate services, and making sure that our work is something that can be measured and replicated. And this presentation includes the creative work of others. The property is being used by permission or under claim of fair use. And the presentation was created pursuant to fair use guidelines. So further use or distribution is prohibited. And I will now turn it over to Dalia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today to listen to the second webinar in the Just Exit series. I am ecstatic and overjoyed to be joined by the dynamic duo of Beth Jacobs and Shamere McKenzie to discuss the really important topic on tap for today. My name is Dalia Racine, and I'm an attorney advisor for AEquitas. And before joining AEquitas, I had the opportunity to prosecute in the Atlanta area for approximately 15 years. And also had the pleasure of starting the first human trafficking unit in DeKalb County, where really my education on this topic, on the realities of it, came from the survivors and came from the service providers working in the field. And I cannot wait to hear all the amazing information that's going to come from our co-presenters who really are the stars of this show. So without further ado, Beth, can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes, my name is Beth Jacobs, and I live in Minnesota. I work for Truckers Against Trafficking, and I travel the country and I train law enforcement on human trafficking. I am happy to be here today, and with that, I will let Shamere introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shamere McKenzie, and I wear many hats. To start out, I am the anti-trafficking ambassador for the country of Jamaica, where I work with the Jamaican government and service providers there to address the issue of human trafficking. I'm also the training manager for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, where I train individuals on how to operate that number you know so well, 888-3737, 888. In addition to that, I serve as the CEO for the Sungate Foundation and as a trainer, consultant, and speaker both nationally and internationally. I will shorten my titles for today, but I do wear many hats, and I'm excited to be here with you today and to be a part of the Just Exhibits with AEquitas.
Thank you so much, ladies. And so today, what we're going to do is build upon the first webinar where it was phenomenal. If you missed it, please go back and check it out. It was a great conversation between Keisha, Wendy, and Jane, and really laid the foundation of the realities of human trafficking. And what we're going to do today is we're going to build upon that, and we're going to discuss the factors that really impact culpability, of taking a step back and really looking at what is happening, how our survivors are getting on ramps to the criminal justice system. And then we're going to analyze that culpability through a trauma-informed lens. It's very easy theoretically when we're having these conversations about being trauma-informed, but we're going to talk about the reality of being trauma-informed, especially when you're coming as a prosecutor and you're assessing your case and making charging decisions and moving forward. And then finally, we're going to talk about designing appropriate dispositions based on looking at that level and impact of culpability and that trauma, so that we're being very intentional and deliberate in how we're handling these cases and making sure that we are not doing further harm and that we are doing the right thing, even when it's not the easy thing to do. So to get us started, Shamere, you talked about all of the presenting that you've done, and this is actually a slide of a quote from one of your presentations where you talk about the bottom is the person in the stable of victims who is appointed by the trafficker. And that word appointed is so powerful. So talk to us a little bit about your use of the word appointed.
This word came about after I have been in several settings, and I saw that people were really confusing the bottom girl with the female pimp and really not understanding the dynamic of the criminal enterprise and the different roles that victims play in this criminal enterprise. And I really wanted people to know that the bottom person doesn't just get up and say, hey, I'm the bottom, I am, I am going to instruct the other girls on what to do in his absence. I'm going to collect the money, right? That role is appointed by the trafficker. So the trafficker looks within the stable of victims and try to really see who is the person that he can groom into this position. Right. And so it is an appointment, and we'll talk about some comparisons later on, but it's not a voluntary position.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that point is so critical in when we're looking at culpability, when you have that individual who is the quote unquote bottom in your case, because oftentimes that is what we see in our cases when we're handling our human trafficking cases. But talk to us a little bit, Shamere, about these power dynamics, building upon what you just were saying and how that plays into kind of that appointment and that process of what you were saying of assessing your stable and kind of figuring out who you want to choose for that position.
Pimp and Ken wrote this book, right, called The 48 Laws of Pimpology, right? And in that book, he talks about 48 different ways of pimping. And one of the ways is get you a bottom. Right? And law number 26 is to use them as scapegoats, right? And when you understand that coming from a trafficker, right? And then having been in a position to be a bottom girl, and you come out of that understanding what you went through in terms of the dynamics between you and the other victims, because it fosters competition and promotes division. Like, why does she get to do these things and I don't, right? And things that we would consider to be privileges in quotes, right? Privilege such as riding the front seat of the car. I got shotgun, whoa, that's a privilege. Is it really a privilege though, right? But that creates, just imagine being in this stable of victims and seeing where, hey, one person gets to drive. One person gets to book the hotel rooms. Why don't I ever have a chance to do that, right? So it creates that power dynamic between victims or amongst victims. It is a technique to maintain power and control that we see in other systems, right? In other criminal enterprises, where we'll get into later on in the presentation. But it helps this trafficker to maintain control over the victims. Like, hey, because sometimes he uses the bottom as, as an example. So he will make an example out of her in his way of enforcing the rules or discipline, right? And then victims will say, well, if that can happen to her and she's the bottom, what will he do to me, right? So it kind of keeps victims in line where it's easier for him to control them. And being the bottom, you know, the roles are being appointed and carrying out his rules and regulations. You are required to recruit other victims, right? And be complicit in criminality, right? And that is what I call as a direct result of simply trying to survive. And a lot of people don't understand that because they're like, well, she recruited. He didn't have a gun to her head the whole time, right? She was driving, right? And when we understand like other legalities around trafficking, like the Mann Act, right? Well, she drove across state lines, so that's Mann Act. We got to prosecute. But under what will be the alternative if she did not drive, right? What would be the consequence? Because just like how, and what I really want people to understand in this power dynamic, just like how there is a consequence if you don't engage in commercial sexual activity, there's a consequence too if you don't follow through with his rules and regulations. And being the bottom, those consequences are greater because he has to maintain that power and control. And I already talked about using the victims of scapegoats, because as Pimpin Ken said in that book, you got to keep your hands clean, right? To evade criminal penalties. That's basically what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's absolutely, you know, what we've seen, what I've seen in the caseload of, and we'll talk a little bit more later also about those dynamics, as well as that despite everything that you've talked about here, that trauma bonding that still takes place and the emotional attachment that still takes place. Beth, was there anything that you wanted to add about this?
You know, and actually, I know it's an appointed thing, but we, in the people that are in the stable, strive to be that person, because they keep telling us that's how we'll be successful. We're the most successful, you know, if we make the most money, and then if we can be the bottom. So it sounds, you know, it doesn't sound right. It sounds kind of crazy, but we do strive to be that person. And I think, yeah, that's part of the manipulation.
And just to piggyback off of what Beth said, I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Okay, just to piggyback off a bit of what Beth said about striving to be that person, right? There is a level of manipulation, brainwashing, both physical and psychological abuse that goes into molding this person. And so when Beth talk about you strive to be that person, it's undertaking, right, these levels of physical and psychological abuse that you will take to be that person. Because you know what? I've seen of other bottoms and they don't get beat as much. They don't get beat as much because they develop this compliant behavior, right? They don't get consequences as other victims because they have developed this compliant behavior because they know what's going to happen. They've been there and have been molded and shaped into this person that really have sunk deeper into the criminal enterprise than, you know, than their eyes can see. That's really masking and covering their eyes so they can't even see the reality of the person that they are striving to be.
And Shamere, to that point, there's an excerpt from the email just as to that mental manipulation that you were just talking about and how they utilize it. And you want to talk about this a little bit and like out of their own mouths of how this manipulation takes place.
Yeah, so this email was sent to me from a mother. And I've been doing these presentations for a while, and I was posted on a website saying I'm gonna be at this conference speaking, and the mother contacted me and she thanked me for, you know, talking about the very thing that we're talking about today. And she says, I want you to use this extract from an email that a pimp sent to my daughter, who was also a bottom, because this mom wants people to understand the mindset of traffickers, right? And so let me just read it for you. You have to force yourself to not run. Force yourself to believe. And before I start this, I want you to understand that this mom's daughter, she was an A student at an Ivy League college. Okay, so when we're talking about who this trafficker sent this to, we have to understand the psyche of this person. And we're not saying because you're in Ivy League, you're super smart, but it takes a certain caliber of person to get admitted to an Ivy League school, let's be honest, right? And so this trafficker, knowing who he was trying to persuade, this is what he wrote to her. You have to force yourself not to run. Force yourself to believe that I'm not going to abandon you. But most importantly, you have to trust that I mean all the things I say to you. You are mine, and I take that very seriously. You have to take it just as seriously. I am the first and the only person you come to when you have problems, fears, or just need someone to listen to you vent. And I am the only one that you come to if you need your other needs handled. I'm your dominant. I am your brother, and I am your friend. I'm also your owner. How can you be submissive to me when you can't give up all the things that hurt you and will continue to do so until you give me all of you inside and out? I am yours as long as you are mine, and I'll protect you. I shield you from the world. I love you, and I will demand to control you as long as you reciprocate by letting me do those things without any fear. You are mine, toy, all of you.
And that's so powerful, hearing that come out of the words of that exploiter, and that tactic and that technique, and the usage of the word owner. We hear all the time the comparison of trafficking to slavery, and we hear it. And you really have a great point, Shamere, of even expanding that example when it comes to trafficking, and when it comes to the comparison to slavery, and using that to also explain the dynamics when it comes to assessing culpability. So I want to go and have you talk about this image a little bit, and then we'll go on to the next image.
So for those of you who are watching keenly and not too busy doing other things in the house, if you look at this image, what do you see? It's an image of slavery, we can all agree. But in this image, it is obvious who's in charge, right? We can look at this image and we can say the person with their arms folded, they're the person in charge, and everyone else is, bent over, picking cotton or whatever it is that they're picking. Everyone else is busy, right? We see some of the people in the back with things over their shoulder. Everyone else is busy because this person is standing arms crossed and he's observing the activity. Now, if you look at this slide, it's not as easy to tell who's in charge, right? People have said, well, it's this woman up front with the basket of cotton in front of her. She's just standing in front of it. Some people would say it's the person in the far right in the back in the red shirt. Or some have said it's this man here in this red overall. When we look at this image, it's not easy to tell who the person is that is in charge. And this is similar to nowadays, right? When we look at trafficking cases and the stable, it's not easy to tell who is in charge because you have a trafficker and then you have the bottom girl who has similar roles, yet they are different. And I compared this to colonial slavery, right? Slaves on the plantation had various roles and privileges, right? But let's not get confused. Even though they had various roles and privileges, they were still slaves, right? Similarly to colonial slavery, you had drivers on the plantation who were appointed, again, here goes that word, appointed by their masters to position of power and authority, right? That was to keep the slaves in check on the plantation. That was to remind them that even though the master is absent, there's still someone watching, and there are consequences if they don't follow through with the rules, right? So similar to the bottom girl on the plantation, it's called a driver. right? In trafficking cases, that same person is called the bottom girl, right? Still slaves on the plantation, subjected to competing pressures, and were favored by their masters, just like the bottom girl. Now, if, when we talk about, being in court, and I know we jumped ahead with some of the slides, but hear me out here for 2 seconds, right? When we look at cases in court, right, and we are talking about, well, she was the bottom, and the victims said, the other victims that we have recovered said they didn't like her because she did this to them and she did that to them, and they did the sorts, right? Or she responded in this way. If we were to roll back the times, wouldn't slaves on the plantation say the same thing?
Yeah. I mean, just the parallels are just uncanny when you think of it in the way that you're explaining it. It's undeniable. Beth, I want to talk to you a little bit about the victim experience in the criminal legal system. So we know a lot of times the reasons for distrust and avoidance can be the prior criminalization, those on-ramps of nobody just kind of asking the why a person might be there. And also just negative experiences with law enforcement and how they're viewed by the community. And then knowing that there's also the overlay with gangs and domestic violence and all the other dynamics. So talk to us a little bit about this component and why, it's magnified when you talk about trafficking victims being brought into the system and maybe not being ready to disclose everything that they've been through.
Yeah, I mean, deep fear is one of the main reasons. They're afraid. When the trafficker first gets a hold of the victim, they don't want you to trust anyone that can help you. They don't, right away, they tell you, don't trust the police. If you trust the police and they come after me, I'm going to hurt you. Or, they just make you not trust them right away. And, I think too, police arrest us over and over and over, even though we're victims, and they arrest us for a crime and they say that we are the criminal when we're not the criminal. And so, it's hard to trust the police when they arrest you over and over and over. And they also, their terminology, I think their language, they've been calling us whores for decades, centuries actually. And so we're pretty disrespected all the time by law enforcement. And so we have this negative experience with them right away, and our communities too look at us. They look down on us like we are, the scum of the earth. And I think that is important. There's no respect, and people don't talk about prostitution and human trafficking and the overlap that is, and that it often is the same. They don't talk about that. They just want to keep those things separate. And I think that makes us feel more victimized, actually.
Yeah, and to those points, that dehumanization, like you were saying, the disrespectful language, the disrespectful treatment, and not to mention, I personally handled cases where law enforcement was the defendant in sexual abuse cases involving women who were being prostituted. And like you were saying, you're constantly getting arrested, and just not to mention the systemic distrust that can often be there as well. There was a study that was done actually by the Urban Institute back in 2018 that said that limited faith in the legal system's ability to remedy harm caused by trafficking and prevent others from experiencing harm was one of the concerns about reporting trafficking. The system itself is prohibiting individuals from being able to come forward and talk about their exploitation and their trauma, and that foreign-born survivors concerned with immigration and limited understanding of the US criminal legal system can also be a barrier. But we know that there's a lot of other influences. Oftentimes we're going to see substance abuse, mental health concerns, the shame, the distrust of the system that's supposed to be protecting victims that is not serving that role, cultural trauma, historical trauma of a distrust of the system, and culturally, how am I going to be perceived if I talk about these things that I've been through. Do you guys have anything that you want to add when it comes to talking about these other influences?
I mean, I think I want to add one thing. We have to remember, like even 20 years ago on the paperwork, when they arrested women for prostitution, it said no humans involved. They didn't even view us as human beings. So this is where we're coming from. I remember when I started the first John School in St. Paul, Minnesota, we worked with law enforcement and community members and the courts for almost a year before we actually started it. And the first day, the police came up to me and he said, Beth, do I go on before the whores or after? And I mean, it just kind of shows you, you know, the thought process that they have. And it's just embedded into the system, and we have to get that out of the system. We have to change that. I think it's slowly changing, but we have to work on that all the time.
Well, and I think to both of your points, this really operates on a spectrum, right? When you're appointed to do certain things, that it's not about, you know, black and white, either 100% victim, 100% offender, that there's really a spectrum of culpability. And sometimes for prosecutors, for law enforcement, it can be difficult to navigate through that area and figuring out where an individual in their conduct may fall. But Beth, you were a part of a really significant study, the National Survivor Network survey. Tell us a little bit about that and talk to us about some of the findings that we see here.
Well, this happened in 2015, 2016. We did a survey to find out how many survivors had the issues, you know, around criminal arrest and detention. And we got 130 respondents to participate in this study. And we asked, you know, different questions. We asked how difficult it was to, you know, obtain housing. How hard was it to get a job? Did this ever, you know, get in your way? Were you arrested for other things? It's a great survey. I mean, I can't tell you all about it because it would take too long, but you should go check it out. Out of the 130 people, the respondents that participated, 91% of them reported having been arrested. It's huge. So almost all of them were arrested. And out of that, for over 50% of them, every arrest on their record was from being trafficked, even if it wasn't, you know, a prostitution charge or a trafficking charge, you know, because the trafficker, like Shamere talked about, you know, he or she, because it could be a woman too, forces that person or that victim to do whatever it is they want to do. If the trafficker is selling marijuana, for example, he's going to make the victim hold the marijuana so he can't get in trouble. You know, he doesn't want to have any trouble. Anyway, it's really interesting because it talks about all the other things that people got arrested for. 42% were arrested as minors, and over 40% were arrested 9 times or more, and 60% were arrested for other crimes. So I think that's really interesting to note, and we have to look at that. I did groups in Hennepin County Jail, right? And the groups were for women who were arrested for prostitution or human trafficking victims. And there was only, I had 30 women in that group, and there was only like 5 that were arrested for prostitution, but they were all trafficking victims.
Yeah, it's almost it's easier when you have the prostitution case because it's obvious what's happening. But when it's those other offenses that requires you to dig a little bit deeper, that's not, you know, something that just comes across your desk and you're just trying to push the files through, of being more deliberate, being more intentional, trying to figure out the why of what's happening. The simple question of, are you okay? And in this study that was done, that they found that US citizen sex trafficking survivors reported more interaction with the American criminal justice system than foreign-born survivors of labor trafficking, to the extent of 72% of sex trafficking survivors had prior involvement with criminal cases as a defendant. And I know that we're really kind of hammering this home, but we want you to understand that this is something that deserves our attention. And it's outside of just the programs that focus on the prostitution arrest. We need to have a systematic screening of the charges that are coming through our offices. There is a program based out of Nashville, Tennessee, Cherished Hearts, and Cherished Hearts actually focuses on offenses that are not necessarily prostitution related. However, the individuals that are participants in the program do have a history of trafficking. And what they found, of their 63 clients that they interviewed from between 2017 to 2019, almost a 2-year period, they averaged 1 current open charge, which was the way that they were able to get into the program because of that active charge. And the charges, though, however, range from having 0 to 9 different charges at that one point in time. What's really astonishing, though, is that the average of 63 clients, the average is 20.97 prior charges. 20.9, almost 21 charges were averaged across 63 clients of prior charges on their record. And that's really hammering home the point that Shamere and Beth are making about this appointment by their exploiters to conduct these crimes. And in conjunction with what Beth talked to us about, that almost half of the survivors interviewed in her survey said that their criminal record resulted solely from their trafficking. And we know that clients who were found guilty of charges, only 3.9 of those charges averaged were prostitution charges. Just looking at this list of the sheer volume and variety of other offenses, whether it be substance abuse, like Beth was saying, having them hold your drugs, having you deal their drugs, traffic violations, location charges, theft, incident, assault, deception, weapon charges. So you can see that this is why we have to delve deeper beyond having a response just to prostitution offenses when we look at these things. And so when we talk about the effects of the arrest, obviously it can really, really impact an individual's life. And I think sometimes as prosecutors, I will speak on behalf of prosecutors in just that sometimes we don't think beyond our immediate actions and don't think of the deeper impact that the arrest can have. And so if you guys can talk to us a little bit about kind of the effects of arrest and based on your experience and the work that you've done, how the effects of arrest can impact individuals in these different ways.
You know, as you were talking, 2 people flashed in my mind, my judge and my prosecutor. I remember my prosecutor saying, Shamere, you are a college student. How could you be in this situation? And the judge also made similar remarks. And I remember specifically the judge saying, Shamere, I don't ever want to see you in my courtroom again, right? And I remember thinking to myself, because at that time, I'm thinking, you know, if you have a felony, your life is over, right? There's no hope. That's it. Pack up your bags and, pardon my language, go down to hell, because that's where you're headed. Like, there is no heaven for you, right? And for a while, that was my truth. That was my reality, that my life was over. All the hopes and dreams that I had, they were shattered because of this felony. And there was a lot of guilt that I had because of that, because I kept asking, why did I have this charge? Why did I have this charge when something was done to me? And when we talk about the effects of trafficking and we see things like employment, right? That's one way that survivors, when I'm hearing this judge say, I never want to see you back in my courtroom, I want you to get your life together and do all these things. Well, how can I get myself together if you're giving me a felony charge, right? That prevents me from having access to employment where I can better myself. Not only that, but the charges that you gave me, any crime that's sex related, under the Marshall Act, you must register as a sex offender, right? And that's in like probably line 99, right? Where you're combing through and you read the first few lines, I'm like, oh, okay, this is what the outcome of this conviction is. And then there you have it. You must register as a sex offender. And when we even understand the sex offender registry, when the average person looks at the sex offender registry, they are thinking these are individuals who have molested or done sexual harm to children, not understanding the long list of things that can cause you to register as a sex offender. So now, on top of your victimization of the trafficker, we now feel re-victimized by the legal system, and now having to be re-victimized by society with this sex offender label. Now, folks, just stop and think. That's 3 levels of victimization. Would you be able to continue with life? Wouldn't you too consider suicide? Because where's the hope? What's left? And this is the reality of many trafficking victims, where we're faced with denying housing opportunities. Where am I supposed to live? I can tell you personally, when Loyola University heard about my story, they offered me a full scholarship to complete my degree. All I had to do was show up. Here it is, a university, right? And all I have to do was show up, but I couldn't pass a background check to get housing. And I can tell you, if you guys know Samantha Vardaman from Shared Hope, I called Samantha and I said, Samantha, this makes no sense. I feel like I should go back to the life. And this is having been out of the life for 10 years in the field, doing presentations, doing work, traveling the world, training law enforcement, doing all these things where I felt that low that I should go back to the life and suffer that level of abuse because I couldn't pass a background check. Luckily, I had the support to tell me to continue to go on, but this is the reality of many trafficking victims that have a criminal conviction as a direct result of their victimization. And I know Beth has a lot to say in this as well. Beth.
I know. Can you see me bursting at the seams? Yes. I say, getting out is the easy part. Putting our lives back together, that's the hard part. And it's for all these reasons, because we can't find employment, housing and education, public benefits. There used to be a question when you applied for public benefits. Have you ever exchanged sex for drugs? And if you said yes, or no, I'm sorry, sex for money. And if you said yes, you were disqualified. So I don't know if all states have changed that now, but some states, Minnesota was like that. You can't get loans, all of these things. You have fines and fees. How are you supposed to pay those off? Immigration is a huge issue. I worked with a woman who came from Mexico, and she was so ashamed and she didn't have papers because he snuck her in. Well, because she came in on somebody else's papers, she couldn't, it was really difficult for her to get papers to stay in America. So, and our states make it really difficult for survivors to get their lives together. Did you know that each state gets to decide how long they hold a prostitution charge against a person for? In Arizona, they hold it against you for 99 years. Yes, 99 years after the offense is how long you have to wait before you don't have to tell every single landlord and every single job you apply for. That's a life sentence, and that's crazy. In Minnesota, I think it's 20 years. I mean, each state gets to pick how long, and that's a way for them to discriminate. And I think that this is important to look at. We need to create new laws that make it easier for survivors to be able to flourish in life. In Arizona, I just wanted to work a job. I got fired for a misdemeanor I got 30 years before. 30 years. I worked my whole life except for the 6 years I was trafficked. And I got fired for a charge I got, a prostitution charge. That was almost 30 years old. That's insane. We need to change that. We can't expect people to rehabilitate themselves and then trip them on the way out the door. We have to help them and support them to get all these things and help them navigate through all these issues, because getting out is the easy part. And we need to make this part easier.
When I look at the examples on this slide, sometimes I give a talk and I call all these examples the invisible prison bars, because I feel like if you had gone to prison for the charge that they slapped you with, right, that would probably be an easier process, right? To sit there and say, hey, you guys said I drove minors across state lines, I should be in prison, right? But when you are given what the judge or the prosecutor is like a second chance of life, but you have to go through being denied housing education, employment, public benefits, loans, a sex offender registry. You are walking inside and you're living daily inside these invisible prison bars where you are free, but you're not really free.
Hmm. Wow, so profound, ladies. This is, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we've really hammered home that it is, yes, okay, the prostitution arrest is, again, the obvious one that we see coming to us, but the co-occurring crimes that we often see are going to be the domestic violence crimes. Again, fostering that competition is going to be the sexual assault, the child pornography, the organized crime with the gang overlay, the money laundering, custody interference, and witness tampering are some of the offenses, as well as also seeing conspiracy, larceny, thefts, weapons, false documents, transporting, sale of drugs, driving offenses, and trespass and petty offenses as well. And to what both Beth and Shamere have been saying, it's obvious that there's this connection when you talk about the appointment, you talk about the atrocities. We all are saying, oh, trafficking's so horrible, but we don't want to admit the fact that people have to do what they have to do to survive that trafficking, to comply with their exploiter. And so it's something that we as a system have to take consideration into. And there's this really, you know, there's a couple ways when we're talking about when we're going through the cases and we're making those assessments and we're making those decisions that we want to assess the culpability. So questions like, did they experience any victimization? What was their actual role in the operation? And what does that mean? To what Shamere explained, the appointment, what does it mean? You know, and Beth said, you know, if you're striving because you have this opinion that maybe you'll get beat less, maybe it won't be as harsh, you know, so that's why you're striving for that role. But is it, you know, you have to pay your dues to get there, right? And so keeping that in mind, and then actually what benefits did they derive from their participation? When we're talking about the actual assessment of, okay, if we think this person is culpable, but why do we think they're culpable? What did they gain from being in this exploitive enterprise? Anything that you guys want to add, talking about these different questions to ask when assessing cases that come before prosecutors?
You know what, Dalia, there's a, as you were talking, as Beth was talking, you know, I often say that we've come a long way in the anti-trafficking movement and in understanding the complexity of trafficking, right? 20 years, here we are 20 years later, and I feel like we are still struggling with understanding the complexity, because I feel like we want to accept a piece of trafficking, right? But then ignore this other piece of trafficking. And if we are going to address this issue, we have to address it as a whole. We can't accept pieces, right, and reject other pieces. We have to look at culpability, right? Yes, but ask that why, as you said earlier, right?
And how about this magic number 18? It's like, speaking on what Shamere's talking about, a lot of people think, well, if this person was a minor, yes, we should let them vacate their convictions and we should, you know, they're deserving of our sympathy. But if that person is 18, oh no, they made choices. Like, I was trafficked at 16, but when I turned 18, nobody mailed me a packet full of information that said, Beth, you have choices now. This is where you go to get a job. This is, you know, you can leave this person and this place will help you. I got nothing like that. So even though I turned 18, I got out when I was 22, but I was still 16 when I got out because I wasn't nurtured. I didn't grow. I just existed. You know, I didn't even live. And it's like, I got no benefits, none at all. I look at this list and I think, what benefits? I don't know of anyone. I work for thousands of women and I can't think of hardly any that made any money or had anything at the end.
But Beth, you know, when we talk about those benefits, right, this is where we need to check our privilege, right? Because there is no such thing as a single issue, as Jessica Emerson often says, right, and have instilled in me. And when we talk about benefits, right, we really have to check our privilege in terms of what do you consider a benefit may not be a benefit to someone else,
This is true. Yes.
right? So to you, it's like, oh my gosh, you got the benefit to sleep in the bed next to him. Yeah,
That's right.
great. I got to sleep beside the monster. That means I am this close to getting backslapped.
Yeah. Yeah. That is true.
So I often hear prosecutors say, well, you slept in the bed. The other victims slept on the floor. Yes, I wish I could have slept on the floor too, to be further away so I'm not easily accessible to that hand.
Yes. And when we're in that life, we do just exist. I mean, we don't think about tomorrow. We don't think about, I once had somebody ask me, you know, what did you think about the trauma you were going through? I didn't think about trauma. I
What
just
is
thought
trauma?
about living. Right. I didn't figure that out. I just wanted to live and breathe the next day. That's it. And so, yeah, I didn't like think about the future, and I didn't think about what would happen later. I just didn't want to die.
And to the point of what you guys are talking about, and really hoping that these conversations that are taking place stick in the mind of those that are making the decisions in the criminal justice system. We have to look at the totality of the circumstances. We have to look at a case, not just at what's on paper, but again, looking and considering all these factors that you've heard Beth and Shamere talk about. And on top of what we previously heard Keisha and Wendy discuss in the first webinar, as to their experiences and the realities and Biederman's chart of coercion and control. And so when we talk about all of these things, just to exactly to what Beth was saying, the age, right? And again, it's astonishing at how we kind of do a full 180 at the magic, 17 to 18 line. At 17, it's all of us, it's complete and total victimization. But at 18, that's where the charges start to stack up. And so thinking again of that, the trauma, and thinking about the experience, and thinking about that, unfortunately, for a lot of survivors of sex trafficking, this is not the first trauma that they've endured. And so that compounding and the layers of the onion that have all been there, that we have to dissect and see and understand. So looking at what was the violence that was endured, how long was this individual in the exploitive situation, how many times were they in an exploitive situation, how were they controlled, how are they involved? Again, the benefits, Shamere, to your point, like what is a benefit, when you're talking about trafficking, and we'll talk about this a little bit at the level of cooperation. But we want to understand the background. We want to understand mental health and substance abuse and how that interplays. And we know that that was talked about in session 1 as well. But understanding that substance abuse, it can be a coping mechanism when you're talking about these extreme situations having to be endured. The rehabilitation, giving a chance, and we talked about this. So how is it that we truly expect people to be rehabilitated? Like, I mean, Shamere, I'm using this, I'm sorry, but the invisible bars, like how profound. And Beth, like you said, getting tripped on the way out of the door. Like, what are we really trying to do as a system for the rehabilitation? And of course, mitigation evidence that might be provided, insight that you can get from additional parties, remorse and the victim's input. And we also have to understand with all of these dynamics, there's also all the elements of trauma, the trauma bonding. You're not going to oftentimes have that individual that's charged and that's just ready to talk. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. And Rebecca Bender says it like just perfectly. If you can't remember the chart, you can't remember the 3 questions, but for the trafficker, would they have done what they did? And we know statistically that 50%, again, of what we saw from Beth's survey, 50% of the survivors surveyed, all of their charges came because of their trafficker. And we have to be conscious of that. And you might say, well, how do we figure this out, right? We get it, we understand, but I have to have evidence. I have to go into court and I have to have an understanding when I'm presenting or when I'm making decisions on what I want to do with my case. Well, we have to think outside of the box, right? We have to think outside of that box and how we gain this information. And so it could be the defense attorney, perhaps The client has given the defense attorney information that they're willing to have shared with you. Maybe sometimes it's the reverse situation where we as the prosecution are educating the defense and saying, hey, I think there might be something going on with your client. I think that we need to kind of dig a little deeper. I think we need to ask some more questions because I think something might be going on. It might be an immigration attorney. It might be victim and witness statements. I can't tell you how many times where we would listen to the victim and witness statements, and there might be a charged party who is asserted to be the quote unquote bottom. But when you listen to the victim and witness statements, you really get the full understanding that they were treated just as badly as everybody else in the case. And that, yeah, they might be portrayed as that ride or die, the one who's going to go and do whatever they want for that exploiter. But the reality is that the level of abuse and the level of manipulation is just as strong, if not stronger, than with anybody else in the case. Expert reports. We have to take it upon ourselves to truly understand the dynamics of trafficking. Looking at the criminal history can literally be walking us down the pathway of understanding the exploitation. And I also would say that looking at the Child Protective Service records can also clearly delineate the pathway to exploitation, to vulnerability, often like what we heard in the first webinar as well, addressing kind of those contributing factors to vulnerability. The exploiter. There is one thing that reigns true in most of my trafficking cases, that the exploiter was not shy to talk about what happened. Were they accurate with it? No. Were they often putting it on the bottom? Absolutely. Well, it was her idea. She was the one who was running the girls. She was the one who was doing everything. Maybe I got a hotel room every now and again, but I didn't know what she was doing. And when you talk about that scapegoating that Shamere talked about earlier, how better does it play into than scapegoating? That manipulation, that, the clinical definition of a psychopath, of having zero regard for anybody else's emotion, anybody else's well-being. And when you see that manipulation, it doesn't stop with the victims. It continues on through the system. It continues on with what they're telling their defense attorney. It continues on with what they're saying in open court. It continues on with what they're telling the judge. It continues on throughout the trial, where they're constantly trying to manipulate individuals. I have literally seen these offenders try to manipulate the jury, get on the stand and tell them what a wonderful person they are and how they just tried to help out their co-defendant or tried to help out that bottom. And now here they are. And now look at all the help that they tried to give them. And woe is me. Look at where it landed me. I was just trying to be a nice guy. And so we have to be very conscious and deliberate of the fact that we are not being manipulated when we are looking at our cases as well. Again, background investigations, social workers and social service providers, psychological, medical, and other experts, and just debriefing on the cases can really be helpful. And to the point of what we were talking about, we are going to continue to talk about this not only today, but in the third webinar. So please join us for that as well, is that we do have tools. We do have tools within our toolkit that contemplate this scenario. This is not a new concept of people being manipulated, coerced into crimes. We have safe harbor laws that protect individuals if they can show victimization, that protect them from being charged. We have affirmative and statutory defenses. And often in many states that you have laws that say that if you can show that you were being exploited, that you were being trafficked, then you are shielded from being charged from those offenses as well. And we also know the common law defense of duress. If you're in a state, there's not many left now, but if you're in a state that doesn't have those protections, that doesn't have that understanding codified within your laws, the common law defense of duress still exists. We have these tools in our arsenal, and we have to be willing to use them, because when we recognize harm, ethically, we cannot further that harm. We have to do something to reverse it. And so when we're talking about possible resolutions, there's, again, that spectrum of possible resolutions of not culpable all the way to presenting mitigation. And it could be from just not prosecuting. That is an option, to not prosecute and provide services. If it's limited culpability, non-incarceration, rehabilitation, step down court monitoring. And then if it's not fully culpable, a cooperation agreement, which I keep saying we're going to talk about, and we are going to talk about, investigation, getting testimony, if that's an option. But again, we're going to talk about that. And then the mitigation, Let's say that there is mitigating evidence. Let's say that there are really egregious offenses, but there's this really strong mitigation present. Well, we could still charge lesser offenses. We could still charge those non-sex offense charges. We could still give the lower offenses or lower sentences so that we're also connecting with services, that we are truly seeking the restoration part of our justice system that is in place. And so finally, here we are at the cooperation piece. So we want to talk about why is it harmful to focus just on cooperation? You know, as prosecutors, the mantra is always like kind of the first to talk, the first to walk, right? And so oftentimes when we're in these situations where we see survivors that are offenders within the system, we see survivor offenders, and as a prosecutor, I go to the defense attorney and I'm like, hey, is she gonna flip? What are we gonna do? Because if she doesn't flip, then you know that I'm just gonna have to try them both, right? Like that's our mantra. Either you flip or you're going to trial. So let's talk about why is it so harmful for us to just focus on that cooperation, on that flipping, on the exploiter? And what else do you think we could do as prosecutors to encourage or facilitate having that cooperation if they're able to at some point for survivor offenders? Beth, Shamere?
So this is something that I have spoken about with so many survivors who have criminal charges, right? And it's like, especially who I call my babies now, who, you know, have recent charges and they have connected with me to help them understand like how they can move on from this, right? And it's like, what they have said to me is simply, the prosecutor only care about advancing her own career or his own career, right? That's all they care about. They're not thinking about, okay, I cooperated, but now in the streets, I'm known as a snitch. Snitches get stitches, right? I have to now walk for the rest of my life and look over my back, look over my shoulder to say, hey, I'm known now as the person who testified against so-and-so, so I have to be very careful. It could be 20 years from now, right? That this person is still coming after me. I've been out the life since 2006, and my trafficker who's convicted and in prison have tried to sue me 3 times for telling my story, right? And so when we talk about those type of cooperation and how it's harmful, it's like, and I'm going to say this with the utmost respect that I have for every prosecutor I know, and even the ones that I don't know, it's like you're mirroring trafficking behaviors. You're saying, if you do this, you get this, right? And it's like, if you put that in context of how the trafficker operates in trying to get results, that's the same thing. We're trying to get results, and that's the same thing. But Beth, I want to give you some time to say a few things because I realize we jumped in at the same time.
That's okay. Well, I was just going to say that, you know, we already have the charge. Like when law enforcement charges us with something and takes us to jail, that never goes away, never, no matter what. We need to figure out a way that can go away. Or, you know, as prosecutors, you can change that charge. Am I right? I mean, you can talk to the law enforcement and you could change it where it's not, okay, like for example, in Arizona, they hold prostitution charges for 99 years. How about if they charge people with something other than prostitution? You know, give them a disorderly conduct, or, you know, try to charge with something that won't be held against them like that. Because the prostitution charge is so hard to get over. You know, you have the sex offender registry, you have all those other things that you wouldn't have with just a disorderly conduct, you know? And I wanted to say too, I'm not going to say too much because, yeah, I know that we're talking a lot. People don't know. Victims don't know about affirmative defense. They've never heard of that. They don't know what that is. You know, if people, you know, even if you're in jail and other people are talking, not many people know what that is and know what you can do with that. And in some states, you have to, Arizona, for example, because I was there, if you don't tell them that you're going to use affirmative defense right away, then it's off the table. You don't get to use it anymore. You have to tell them within, I don't know if it's 24 hours or what, but it's before the average person would even know what it is. So I guess that's what I was going to say. Maybe if you could guide them and help them where it wouldn't be so hard for a victim or survivor to carry on with their life. We got to make it easier. We can't keep tripping them.
And Beth, when we talk about carrying on with your life, we're talking about some survivors who cooperated, right? Provide
Yes.
testimony against their trafficker, but still end up with the bad end of the stick. It's
Yep.
like, hey, where was the compromise? If this is supposed to be a plea deal, where is the deal? Because the only person that seemed to get a deal here was the prosecutor. Where is the deal for the survivor?
And the survivor, all I wanted was to work a job. That's all I wanted. I wasn't asking for free money. I wasn't asking for anything free. I just wanted to work and support myself like everybody else. I felt like that was my right according to the Constitution, isn't it?
Well,
To be able to work.
I'm so sorry. But I was just going to say that was a perfect segue into this slide, which again goes back to the National Survivors Network survey. So talk to us a little bit about your findings with the survey with the cooperation statistics.
Oh, it was crazy. 22% of the respondents felt like they had to testify against their trafficker to get help or services. And law enforcement actually tells you that. They say, if you don't tell on your trafficker, we won't help you. I mean, we've been talking about that for a while now. 30.5% felt pressure to testify by law enforcement. And this is, remember, this is only 130 participants, and what was it? 90% of them were arrested. So it's not like it's a lot of people. 75% reported that they were not able to report their trafficking, mostly because of the fear. And no one ever asked them. Do you want to tell on your trafficker? I mean, I was arrested so many times, and not once did somebody say to me, do you want to arrest, should we try to arrest your trafficker? Or do you want, that person to get in trouble? Never. It was all about me. I went to jail. In fact, I had a district commander come in and tell me he thought I was crazy because I went to jail every day for 2 months. But that was the deal I made with the police. I could meet them after I got my money and they'd take me to jail and I'd bond out and I'd have the money. The pimp would be happy and the police would be happy. So it's kind of crazy. Anyway, I got kind of off of the survey. You should definitely check out the survey. I think you would really like the information in there.
Well, I think it's absolutely phenomenal in revealing the realities of the system and the survivor offenders. And so when we talk about, the victim experience, and we talk about what can we do, right? How do we facilitate building that trust, repairing that relationship, because there is so much distrust, not only based off of personal experience that a survivor may have had, the historical trauma, again, the community lens, like you guys talked about already, and how much of a prohibition that can be to trusting, and the trafficker as well. And, we've had the opportunity to work with prosecutors all over the world who deal with trafficking cases. And in some places, they actually refuse to have any interviews with a survivor until they have received services. And if we think about, again, like you were saying, Beth, in the survey finding that, so many survivors felt like they could not get services unless they flipped on their trafficker, on their exploiter. And to Shamere's point about how dangerous that can be for the individual, and not to mention if there's still that trauma bonding to their offender, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But, you can see how this can compound and really kind of prohibit an individual under any circumstances, let alone a trafficking circumstances, from being able, not even willing, but being able, because of course your self-security is going to be priority, your self-preservation is going to be priority. So why would you endanger that by cooperating and having that to be contingent on whether or not you receive services and you receive what you need for a rehabilitation. So I think that could be very impactful. And to the other point of what you were talking about, you know, of the healing of just wanting to have a job. And Shamere, you talked about this too, of that sometimes the system itself can be mimicking the exploiter, right? The control, the lack of autonomy, that there's really nothing that the individual can do, but it's like being passed from one exploiter to the next once they get into the criminal justice system, if we're not conscious of it. What I want to do now is show a brief video that Shamere brought to our attention. And then Shamere, I want to come back to you to talk about some of the takeaways from this video. And so what we're going to do is watch the video on what is Stockholm Syndrome, given by an individual who was explaining what the Stockholm Syndrome is. So we will cue that up.
Kidnapped, raped, and held as an 18-year hostage, J.C. Lee Dugard was rescued. But rather than condemning her captor, she shockingly referred to him as a great guy.
On the surface, Dugard's behavior seems bizarre, but it's typical of a psychological phenomenon known as Stockholm Syndrome. Victims of Stockholm Syndrome develop compassion and loyalty towards their captors. The condition follows psychologically traumatizing situations like hostage situations and kidnappings. In fact, Stockholm Syndrome got its name in 1973 when two thieves accosted a bank in Stockholm, Sweden, taking 4 bank employees hostage. For 6 days, the prisoners were held in a bank vault, tied to explosives with nooses around their necks. During a rescue attempt, police were shocked when the captives took offense, siding with the captors. Like the Stockholm victims, people who develop this condition endure situations where they're forced to contemplate the reality of severe injury or death. In order for Stockholm Syndrome to develop, a victim must also perceive that her captors have shown occasional kindnesses. Being permitted to eat, not being punished for a so-called transgression, and even being allowed to live are all considered benevolent to someone with Stockholm Syndrome. People with Stockholm experience symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder patients. They may have flashbacks, nightmares, distrust of others, and the inability to enjoy previously pleasurable activities. No one is sure why this phenomenon occurs, but it has been suggested that a victim believes, perhaps unconsciously, that forming an attachment to her captor maximizes her survival. Oddly, Stockholm Syndrome doesn't resolve in tandem with the end of a hostage situation. In the 1973 bank robbing, the freed hostages remained loyal to their captors, even setting up a fund to cover the criminals' legal fees. These symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome are actually something of an anomaly, because according to FBI reports, 73% of abduction victims show no compassion or affection for their captors. And for the other 27%, long-term therapy together with short-term anxiety or sleep medications offer Stockholm Syndrome sufferers an excellent chance to recover and resume a normal, healthy life.
So, Shamere, in watching that video, and along the lines again of what we were talking about cooperation and making it dependent on cooperation, I want you to just go through some of the key takeaways that you thought were really relevant to the trafficking scenario that were presented in that video.
So when we talk about trauma, right, we all know trauma impacts the brain. As an individual, you don't get to say, hey, trauma, I want you to impact me in this way, right? Or hey, trauma, impact me in this way, right? When trauma impacts the brain, it is a response that you don't have control over, right? You can take control as to how you're going to live based on this how it impacts the brain. And what this psychiatrist is saying is long-term, keyword, long-term therapy, right? With short-term anxiety and self-medication offers Stockholm sufferers an excellent chance to recover and resume a normal, healthy life. It doesn't happen overnight, right? Because when that trauma comes and say, hey, I'm going to impact this way or that way, not the way that Shamere want to say, hey, trauma, when you impact me, just keep me up at night, right? Don't let me go cuckoo for Cocoa Pops, right? That's not how it works, right? But what we're seeing is that therapy can help. Therapy, along with some medication for those who need it, can help. He also says, with love and support, expert guidance, and patience, Stockholm can be rooted out over a period of time. I can tell you, the reason why I'm here to be on this webinar today is because I had support. I had support from several individuals who believe in me, wanted me to excel, right? I gave you the example earlier of when I went back to school. I called my former boss to say, hey, what's the sense of going back to school and getting this scholarship if I can't pass a background check? I'm thinking of going back to the life. She was there to support me and reminded me of my accomplishments. That's what we have to be when we're talking about helping survivors who've come out of this experience, being supportive, providing that guidance, being patient. Yes, I mentioned being cuckoo for Cocoa Pops because when you haven't experienced trauma, and trauma is manifesting itself for those of us who have experienced trauma, we are like, ooh, they are like, as my therapist likes to put it, they're in crazy pants mode, right? And we have to keep it real. And I'm not saying that, hey, I'm putting down survivors or I'm putting down individuals who have experienced trauma. I'm trying to look at it from those lens of those who haven't gone through trauma and what behaviors we may be presenting or manifesting. It's also important to note that as we are thinking about prosecuting these cases and investigation, that if she's suffering from Stockholm syndrome, you cannot get her to cooperate in one interview, right? Here you are saying, hey, I'm trying to help you. And in her mind, she's like, and I'm trying to help my man, right? Because she has that bond, she has that connection, and that's a part of the manipulation and the molding that I talked about earlier. And you could see it in that email that trafficker sent, where he kind of did this give and take, right? He was like, here you go, but pull back, here you go. It's like a tug of war with the heart, right? And that's what we're seeing when we talk about individuals who have experienced Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah, and Beth, to that point, to what Shamere was talking about, can you just cover a little bit, in talking about those needs and talking about that support that Shamere was talking about, what that looks like?
I think she's absolutely right. Each person is in their own place. And I think therapy should be coupled with educational support groups. I think it's really important for someone to be able to work on stuff within themselves, as well as be around other people that this happened to, so they don't feel so alien, I should say. I think that really helps people out. It goes a long way. I think it's important that prosecutors work with other survivors who are healing and who are at a different place than the people that they're trying to help right now, because it helps them. I think law enforcement should work with survivors too. It helps people who are just coming out of the life see that, you know what, I can make it. Somebody else made it, and when we're working with them, don't ask them about their pimp or their trafficker. I don't know if you'll understand that, but in my worldview, that was my boyfriend. And I didn't look at him as a pimp or a trafficker. That was my boyfriend. And the prostitution part kind of became irrelevant. That's what I had to do for someone to love me. And I just got used to the whole family thing because, or stable, as you would call it. It seems crazy that a person would get used to that, but I did get used to it. And I think listening is good. Nobody ever listened to me when I was out there. You know, I was very disrespected, and I was told not to speak, really. I had to look at the ground, you know, so listening, using active listening skills is really important. And I think trauma-informed care is extremely important. You know what this is about. I mean, watching this webinar is going to help you, you know, understand more what this is about. So be as educated and as aware as possible, you know, and we're all just like we're all different. Survivors different too, you know, they're at different places. Supportive services are more important. I made this slide just for people to kind of glance at. I mean, I won't read the whole thing to you, but you know, victims have immediate needs. They need a safe place. Tell them you got a safe place for them for 24 hours, you know. Help them get their kids safe, because a person's not going to leave their children in that circumstance. You know, make sure they have food and hygiene, and make outreach packs if someone's going to leave their trafficker, so they would have everything in that bag that they would need for one night, you know, washcloth, soap, toothbrush, all those kind of things. You know, let the family know that they're safe, and listen, once again, listen to them within 24 hours. That's when you need to make a case plan. You know, figure out where they can get safe temporary housing. Where can they stay for 30 days, you know? Get their personal belongings, get any ID. You know how hard it is to get ID? I worked with a woman who was born in Illinois for 9 months to try to get her birth certificate. It was impossible. It's like the chicken and the egg. You need the social security card to get the birth certificate. You need the birth certificate to get the social security card. So it was really, we went round and round. Remind them that they're safe. Ask what they need. You know, what do they want? Do they want treatment, therapy? Offer them, you know, to file an OFP, because it is domestic violence. I've heard so many people say, oh yeah, traffickers, that's not domestic violence. Oh yes, it is. I think it is. What do you think, Shamere?
I think it is when you understand
Yes.
the relationship dynamic, because you know, as experts who are seeing this as a trafficker and victim, but when you look at victims who are seeing this as, this is my man, this is my boyfriend, this is my boo, and if this is how the trafficker has presented it in terms of recruitment, that it's going to be me and you, it's going to be Bonnie and Clyde, you know, I'm going to exit this life and retire and be a square, and it's going to be me and you, right?
That's right. And so, you know, within the next week, find long-term housing, help them navigate the services. They're going to have all kinds of health needs, because traffickers don't like to let you get health care. You know, get the appropriate clothing they'll need. Do they need career attire to find a new job? You know, secure their belongings in storage. Help them find a therapist and support groups. And address the legal issues, because, oh my goodness, it takes a long time. You know, now we're creating vacating laws, but it takes a long time to petition the court to vacate convictions, you know, from being trafficked. So help them start that process. A lot of people don't even think about those things, and those are important things.
Yeah, and carrying on with that, talking about the long-term goals. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yes. Secure, you know, permanent housing. Where can they live? You know, they need to be self-sufficient. Help them with that. They, you know, order a copy of that birth certificate. That takes a long time to get. Apply for a driver's license or photo ID. And I know that's really hard, but there is AMVA, American Association of Motor Vehicles. They will help a human trafficking survivor get an ID. That's one thing I accomplished with Truckers Against Trafficking. So they will help someone get ID. You just have to talk to a supervisor, you know, and handle the legal issues. Do their criminal background so that they know what's going to pop up when they're trying to get a job or trying to find housing or all these other things. Try to, you know, point them into the direction of pro bono attorneys who can help them vacate convictions. You know, you have to go to each state and vacate it separately. So I think I had convictions in 5 different states. And so I had to go, you know, to find 5 different attorneys in different states to do that. So help them set all that up. You know, and child protection, I think, is really important. Lots of people are dealing with child protection, you know. advocate for them, advocate for that survivor for them in court, because they really need that. Create the case plan with the survivor, not for them. That's two different things. If you do it for them, you're telling them what to do. If you do it with them, it's that pride and ownership. They own part of that. If they have to go to parenting classes, let them pick the parenting classes they're going to go to. As long as they're parenting classes, it doesn't matter, and it makes them empowered. It helps them feel like they're part of that. And help them figure out school, certified training, on the job training, and I think this last one is so important. Encourage legislators to create laws that empower survivors. When you're creating laws, vacating laws, for example, in your state, make sure that they'll cover other charges and not just prostitution charges. Look back at National Survivor Network survey and look at the other program that Dalia talked about, and see what those charges are, because it needs to be wider. We can't just only have prostitution charges. It has to be other. I had a charge that was indecent conduct, and the judge was willing to vacate all of my convictions except that one, because he said, even though it was in the middle of your trafficking, you could have went to a bar and swung on the chandeliers naked. That's what he said. And he didn't want to vacate that one. And that was kind of silly. So we had to order a copy of the police report, and they did all that. And he did finally vacate that one. But it took a while because it was not written in the law. So we have to be careful and make sure that those other charges are written in those laws.
Absolutely. Shamere, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Beth sent us home with that. She did that beautifully.
Well, and if nothing else, to those that are listening to this webinar, we hope that you're inspired to be the change, because when we talk about as a system, what we are here to do is to seek justice. And so what that looks like is, it looks like making sure that our arrest policies are truly recognizing who the victim is. And when we're making the cases, when we're making referrals, and not making our referrals to services contingent on cooperation for all the reasons we talked about during this session today. The case assessment, really taking the lens of everything you've heard today through this webinar, everything you heard in webinar 1, everything you'll hear in webinar 3, and take it upon yourselves to truly understand this. And like I said, my education came from survivors, and it's what really motivated me to be a change maker within the criminal justice system where I worked, and to educate. And we've got to start with ourselves. And then criminal record relief, which we'll go deeper into in the final webinar number 3. And like you heard both Shamere and Beth talk about, is how critical criminal record relief is to the restoration of trafficking survivors. So we've got to be the change. And ethically, as prosecutors, the ABA is very clear that when a prosecutor knows of clear and convincing evidence establishing that a defendant in your jurisdiction was convicted of an offense that they did not commit, that you shall seek to remedy the conviction. If nothing else, the appointment, the coercion, the manipulation, the trauma bonding, the fear, the self-preservation that we have talked about throughout this session, that is what should stick in your mind when you have that lens. And if you feel that there is somebody within your jurisdiction who was wrongfully convicted, and now having that insight to understand that that should not have ever happened, we have an ethical responsibility to change that. And we will hear further in webinar 3 about those remedies, but the 3 main ones being sealing records, where the records are hidden from private entities, expungement, where the record is erased, and vacature, where the conviction is nullified, and exoneration. And for a lot of these remedies, sometimes the fear of prosecutors could be, well, we'll just lose that information. We always have the information. That's not the concern, and nor should it be the concern. The concern is, are we seeking justice? And so in webinar 3, we'll go deeper into these different remedies, but just always keeping that at the forefront of your mind. So again, if you missed the first webinar, please go to the AEquitas website that you see on the screen. Go check it out, webinar 1, where it was covered, the realities of trafficking. And also join us for webinar number 3 on December 8th. at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, where we'll be discussing achieving justice for victims and the prosecutor's role in that. And so we just want to also offer an opportunity. There will be more information coming about becoming a Just Exit site. Be sure to contact Just Exit at equitasresource.org. We are going to do deeper, more intensive work with selected pilot sites on these very principles that we're talking about to put in place logistical and practical measures within your own criminal justice system, so that we are not just talking the talk, but walking the walk when we're doing this type of work. And so going forward, we want to make sure that we're assessing our cases on an individualized, trauma-informed basis. We heard why. We heard that it is an individual experience, and it's an experience that you don't have any control of how it will impact you. We want to consider immunity and alternative dispositions, understanding the long-term effect of our arrest and how that impacts negatively in the restoration process. And we want to be proactive and retroactive in ensuring that trafficking survivors receive justice from our system. And so I cannot thank my co-presenters enough. Beth Jacobs, thank you so much for your phenomenal information. Shamere, Beth, do you want to share your contact information?
Sure. You can reach me at bethsblurbs@gmail.com, or as you see, 520-488-7399.
And Shamere, thank you as well for your phenomenal insight. And if you want to talk about your contact information.
You can reach me at sun-gate.org, or visit me on the website, sun-gate.org. Given the busy nature of my life, I may not always be able to answer phone calls, but if you send me an email, I'll get around to it.
Thank you, Shamere. And my contact information with AEquitas, you can reach me at Racine at equitasresource.org, but check us out at www.equitasresource.org. Tons of free resources dealing with the prosecution, investigation of human trafficking cases, as well, of course, of this Just Exits webinar series. And again, I cannot thank Beth and Shamere enough for your participation within this project, for your transparency, and just for your resilience and just being overall awesome. Thank you, ladies, so much for everything. And we will turn it back over to Holly.